Well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Collision Live. Daniel here, and joined at the desk, as I always am, by the Dungeons to My Dragons, Mr. Samuel David Kemp. What is up?
Not much. I'm about halfway through my pilgrimage of light and magic, the behind-the-scenes documentary about internet or industrial light and magic, the special effects arm that George Lucas created when he started A New Hope.
Is it making you feel like super not creative or like
Oh yeah,
innovative
and like totally incompetent at everything. Like you see the models and stuff that these guys are making, and they like building cameras from scratch to like do the things that they need them to do for their movie. I'm just like, wow, like that's
those sort of stories make me realize like I will never be those people. I'm not smart enough for that.
But it's cool to watch.
But it's cool to watch other people be smart. And it's great to have you guys join us if you're joining us live. Again, don't be shy to jump into the comment section, join the conversation as we sort of look at what's going on this week in pop culture and kind of navigate it as Christians. But anything kind of going on this week? We got a new espresso maker in our studio.
Oh, yeah.
So this episode is brought to you by caffeine. So we're
blessed and highly caffeinated, as they say.
So we are amped up. But speaking of caffeinated individuals, how's our crew doing? We got Joni and Steven joining us once again. How are you guys? You guys got your coffee going? You guys are good?
We're doing great. On my second cup now.
If you start seeing the little twitch in their eyes, is that they are just knocking it back. But yeah, we do have a lot of interesting stuff to get into this week. Maybe not as a slightly slower week as far as like big news stories, but I still think there's some interesting kind of conversations to have. So on that note, why don't we just jump right into it with our first segment of our show? We have Cultural Conversations. So a couple of things kind of going on this week that sort of stood out to me as I was trying to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening, kind of a variety of different stories. Maybe the first one, which maybe doesn't seem initially something that Christians should care about. But hey, if you're a consumer, if you're a parent, if you're someone that is into pop culture, it does affect you one way or the other. So just I think maybe the start of this week or end of last week, it was sort of announced that the Disney Plus streaming platform, which again includes kind of a bundle with Hulu and ESPN and all that, has passed Netflix for total subscribers. I think Disney now has 221.1 million subscribers, passing Netflix, which has 20.7 million subscribers. And it's crazy. It's sort of like obviously, Disney's a massive platform, but they are the upstart. They've only been around for, like, three years, not very long.
Yeah.
Netflix has been around forever. So it's kind of, obviously Netflix has been in the news lately just for, it's sort of losing subscribers and they've hit a rough spell. But as you kind of see this, is there anything to this, or is it just like, hey, things change tastes, or like?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, Disney just has such a massive and well-loved back catalog, I think, is probably part of it. And, I do think the other part of it as well is they have been a bit more focused on episodic releases than Netflix. The sort of like, here's everything all at once, and you can just spend all day Friday and Saturday watching whatever show just came out. And so I think that's part of it. But I would think probably just the properties that Disney has is just like way more loved and like watchable than like, I don't know that there's too many things on Netflix that are just like, every year we're going to sit down and we're going to watch, this beloved show or movie.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think, more like quantity over quality, like, and even just like the back catalog, some of the classics. And again, I think probably the biggest reason Netflix is struggling is because most Netflix shows just aren't very good. And the ones that are good, like, I really enjoyed the last Stranger Things season. There's a couple of shows that maybe kind of throughout the year we watch, is that you can watch them in like 2 days and then you unsubscribe and you resubscribe in a couple of years and those shows come back. And I don't know, I think maybe I might be overthinking thinking this, but I do think there's something about this, like, because Netflix is kind of the last holdout of this, like, binging. Like, a couple of years ago, like, everything was binging, and it was just sort of like paradise of, like, hey, no more waiting, like, get, sugar rush, get it all at once, just, cancel all your week plans, just do nothing but watch your favorite show. And I feel like that seemed super appealing to, like, impatient humans like us. But I think kind of what we've seen with sort of the downfall or like the decrease of Netflix is like that a lot of what makes like these shows interesting and like valuable is that you actually can like talk about them each week and like think about what's going to happen next and kind of engage, kind of the more communal aspect, and not just sort of this like super isolated like I'm going to watch this whole show this weekend, but then I can't talk about it because people that have more friends and social lives than I do probably haven't finished it yet. And so I don't know, I do think that sort of this binging kind of mentality this goes against or a lot of like just the way we're wired to like be more in like community. And
yeah, I think so. And I think this is probably just sort of the latest evidence that is the case, that we do actually, despite our protestations, like we actually kind of like having like a new episode once a week or whatever. And I think that just builds the anticipation, and it's sort of just like, it's like when you're eating a bowl of ice cream, like if you just wolf it all down at once, like sure it's good, but if you like try and savor it, like you make that feeling last longer. And I think that's sort of what you get with like, even though we prefer to just wolf it all down at once, I think in reality we like to savor it over the longer periods.
Yeah, or you just wolf it down and then get a second bowl and you
that too.
Or you live your life that way. What about our crew? Are you guys subscribed to either one of these platforms? You guys me and Sam are the grumpy guys with kids. You guys aren't. Are you guys Netflix people or Disney Plus people?
I'm Netflix, for sure.
I'm more Netflix.
So you guys will just sit down and just watch it, all 10 episodes at once?
I go through stages of I'll go like Stranger Things. I'll watch it and then I won't touch Netflix for a while.
Okay.
I normally just watch it with my mom, like at night. And like we watch like 2-3 episodes at once. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe it is sort of some of like, I know Disney is like, hey, when you, like me and Sam, you have kids, you need those like Disney cartoons to entertain your kid. I know Netflix just has a lot, maybe more junk and stuff for parents to deal with. Hey, let us know. If is there anything to it, kind of the binging streaming thing, or is just sort of like maybe a generational thing or whatever it could be. But I do think there is some relevant stuff for Christians. Kind of another story that, and kind of a conversation that just sort of, I think maybe yesterday or maybe the day before, Tom Holland, Mr. Peter Parker himself, Spider-Man in the MCU and Uncharted. He's been in a bunch of other movies. Just kind of he's kind of one of, I think, the like the A-list, like kind of the few kind of leading men, even though he is sort of, I guess, younger and not quite as like proven. But he just announced that he is sort of stepping away, quitting social media, proving that he is just as intelligent as he is good looking, making the right decision. But here's sort of his reasoning behind it. Then we can kind of get into this. He says, I've taken a break from social media for my mental health because I find Instagram and Twitter to be overstimulating, to be overwhelming. I get caught up and I spiral when I read things about me online, and ultimately it's very detrimental to my mental state. So I decided to take a step back and delete the app. And I think he's not the first. Like, there's been other in recent, like I think you were saying, like Millie Bobby Brown.
Yeah, I think I'd heard something about her quitting it or taking a break or something. So it's not unheard of for people to.
Yeah, and I think it's like Selena Gomez, maybe like for I don't know if she's back, but she did for a while. So there has been these celebrities, people like in the spotlight that are like, hey, this is just, it's not good to be on here. A lot of people talking about me, but I do think it becomes kind of a relevant conversation. One, just because he's so like public. That sort of, like if I quit social media, the news, no one cares. But someone like Tom Holland quit social.
I would care.
Would you care?
Yeah.
He quits. It becomes more of a story, and you can kind of use that to talk just a bit about sort of the impact of sort of social media on just sort of mentally, like the mental health aspect of it. I think I feel like we know the dangers of it.
Yeah.
But it becomes more of like I guess like a public conversation when like someone as like like this rich and famous, powerful guy, when he's sort of saying, hey, this is too much. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of maybe in some ways social media is the great leveler, that no one is more equal than anyone else on social media because it has like pretty much the same negative effect on everyone, and that I think the pressures that it puts on you as an individual is the same that it would put on somebody like Tom Holland, like probably just to a much greater extent, and that like no one is immune to sort of just the horrible things people say on social media. And so I think it's good. And my wife and I have taken like sometimes we'll take like a month off of social media from time to time, and I think it's good at least to take sort of segments of time where you just don't do anything on social media, just to remind yourself that like what happens on Twitter is not like real life, or what happens on whatever social app you're using. And I think it can be very, very beneficial to kind of just step away from that from time to time.
Yeah, and I do think like because he's framing it like he's stepping away. It's not necessarily like this permanent like like I think was it like one of the Kardashians or something that made us big. They're leaving and like now they've had time away and like they're out of the spotlight for like a week and they came back. I do think like social media, like despite all the badness of it, like it's so ingrained now in society.
Yeah.
That, like I don't know, maybe eventually things change, but like it's hard to imagine like in our lifetime at least like it ever sort of like where everyone just decides, hey, it was sort of a failed experiment. Let's go back to the good old days of. But I do think like, I think his sort of example of just like there's value though, and just like hey, I still want to have it, I still want to use it now and then, but like just step away and like not be so tied to just like public opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like it's probably the number one like best thing you can do for your well-being if you are someone who's on it all the time. Like just cut that out for a while and just see how your life changes a little bit. So I would certainly recommend it for anyone who just kind of gets sucked into social media, and I think we can all at various degrees. And so I think it's good to just kind of make a hard break from it from time to time.
Yeah, and again, normal peons like us don't have the same like care and interest as like some of these Hollywood celebrities, but I do think there is that like temptation just to like care like how many people like liked your picture or like what kind of comments, or just be tied to like even in like a lesser degree of like you're just sort of your well-being is sort of tied to these like other people on social media. So hey, let us know you guys how you guys navigate social media, if it's something that as Christians we need to maybe think through a little bit more. Another conversation, another story that maybe not a whole lot for us to get into. I just thought this was one of the coolest things I've ever seen, so I wanted to get it on the show somehow. So this is a picture that was kind of going, kind of became viral on social media in the last week. If you're not familiar with the Lord, if you haven't checked out our collision review here on the channel for Prey, you maybe won't know this is the Predator, kind of the iconic creature in cinematic lore. Just had the new kind of prequel movie that dropped on Hulu a couple weeks ago. But this is really a picture of like the Predator getting his hair and makeup done, and it's like it's the Predator. Like it's a costume. It's not like some digital. It's not some guy at a computer making the Predator. And like just the positive, I guess, comments and like discussions on social media about just this picture and the fact that like it's not just sort of this digital creation. I don't know. Like I know the discussion of like digital, physical, like that's been going on for a while. And like I know sometimes it's overstated because even like the practical movies have just like tons of digital effects.
Sure.
And, like, so I know it's not as like simple as that, but like what is it do you think about like the fact that this is like a tangible thing that still like we just latch on to more than like even in a time when like digitally we can do more than like ever in history.
Yeah, I mean I still think you can tell a difference like in most cases. Like I think that's the thing that sort of keeps digital from being all it could be. I think the best result is when you like pair the practical with some digital effects, and I think movies that maybe do that well are like I think like the Bourne movies and Mission Impossible movies, and any movie that's gonna do well. I mean Dune I guess would be one as well. Like obviously there's tons of special effects in all these movies, but because there's enough like it's not just the Mandalorian in a room surrounded by like a giant LED screen, and so I think it's just you can tell on screen the textures of it and everything. Like it just looks like, at least to me, so much better than sort of the purely digital.
Yeah, and I do think it is sort of like, and again, maybe we'll see, maybe I'll be wrong, but like just the we have like the Zuckerberg and Facebook and sort of this whole digital future, and like I do think things like this, like sort of that kind of draw, and maybe that's just our generation. And like as as my kids grow up, they'll just want everything digital, no more practical effects. I don't know, but like that there is just something about like tangible and like
Yeah.
this sort of this digital virtual world that like that just still even like when it looks as good as it's ever looked. Like
Yeah. And I'd say probably a big part of that is just lighting, because it's so hard to digitally like mimic what happens when a scene is lit that's like a physical, tangible scene. There's so many just nuances of light in that scene that it's just very, very hard to like do all the shadows and the light and the fill and all that in digital. And so I think that's probably one of the things that make it seem more real, because it is. And so like although we've come a very long way, I think there's still lots, there's some pretty obvious gaps between like digital and real.
Yeah, and that's even like an extension of that, like why I think like physical books won't die out the same way. Like music, it's digital, but like you still hear it's still the same experience. But like books, like, this thing tangible. Like I feel like we are still a tangible people, and despite sort of this virtual world. So I don't know. I just think it's a cool picture. I do think that the switch to everything, kind of this virtual reality, is maybe not as near as people like to think. And sort of our last kind of cultural conversation before we get into host corner and kind of the main topic. This is something that just I think it was yesterday. I was coming out, and again, it's sort of another example of like an ongoing conversation that's been happening really over the last maybe 5 or 6 years. Bryce Dallas Howard, the daughter of director Ron Howard, who just directed 13 Lives. Check out her review on the channel.
Very good movie.
She's a talented director in her own right. She did directed some episodes of like The Mandalorian, and then she's an actor. She's been in a bunch of stuff, including the Jurassic Park movies. So she was talking about that again. If you're watching the video version, her and Chris Pratt both kind of starring in this, and kind of sharing that there have been some reports that like her pay for kind of as a co-star of the Jurassic Park movies was about $2 million kind of per film less than Chris Pratt, who was her co-star. And sort of in an interview that just came out about a day ago, she says, "I was paid so much less than the reports even said, so much less. When I started negotiating for Jurassic, it was 2014, and it was a different world, and I was at a great disadvantage. And fortunately, you have to sign up for 3 movies so your deals are set." And kind of she goes on in the interview to kind of to pump up Chris Pratt, saying that he sort of went to bat for her and like with like theme parks and toys and like bumped up her deals elsewhere to kind of compensate, and it all worked out. But kind of the gender pay gap is usually called, like that discussion's been going on kind of even outside of like entertainment and stuff. And I do think it's an important discussion, but I think, I don't know, as we tend to do, I think we do maybe simplify it and like what do you
I mean, I think things like this, it's just sort of a massive oversimplification of what's going on. And like there's no doubt there are issues in equal pay and all that, but I think to boil it down to like I'm a woman and I got paid less because I'm a woman, like is just a way oversimplification of a lot of these instances, because it's not necessarily like that's not why that she necessarily got paid less. And I don't know the specifics of her deal or any of that kind of stuff, but in general, when they sort of bring this up, it's just a very oversimplification of what's happening, because it's not typically that they're worse actors or like somehow not as good or not on screen as much, but it's a lot of times it boils down to who's selling the films and who's selling the tickets for this. And like
because I think like at least for me, like the because I kind of talk like all as though all things are equal, and like they really aren't equal. And again, like, I think there is stuff maybe to address downstream, but like I think one of the at least when this conversation happens, like one of the misconceptions is that like these people are being paid primarily to act, which in a sense they are, but really like their pay is hinged, like that's why like is Tom Cruise necessarily the best actor in Hollywood? He's good. I don't know if he's the best actor. There's some character actors. Just putting Tom Cruise on a movie poster sell you way more tickets than putting some fresh out of some Shakespearean actor moving from the stage. Like absolutely, it sells way more movies. And like I think so some of like this discussion, like I don't know if it's necessarily this that Chris Pratt's a man, she's a woman, therefore like I think she's probably a better actor than Chris Pratt is. I think she's probably more talented like behind the scenes and a camera. Like she's more gifted. She grew up in that life. But like especially in like 2014, like put Chris Pratt on a movie poster, some standalone movie, put her on a movie poster. Like Chris Pratt's going to sell more tickets. Like Chris Pratt's more of a draw. And like, so at least for me, like, not that there isn't an issue. Like I think the real issue is more like, we need to, how do we build up the star power and like give opportunities for someone like Bryce Dallas Howard, who's talented, to like, to be able to sell a movie and like be more of a draw. But I do think when we simplify it too much to just like, well, it's just obviously because she's a woman and like, the director just doesn't like, or like the cast or whatever, like just doesn't like women. So he's going to give you more and you less. And like, I think it is more complicated than that. And like, we're not doing any favors by just framing it very simplistically. Like, woman in a man's world. Like,
yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing. And that's always going to be the case with any sort of complex issue, is like the danger in oversimplifying just, I think, sort of continues to just propagate the issues or kick the can down the road, and like it doesn't actually solve the problems that arose in the first place. And so I just always be aware of oversimplified arguments for or against something.
Yeah, and I think you kind of end up like distracting from the actual, if it's just that men hate women, like then that's what you're trying to campaign against, when like maybe the issue is more opportunities and like other stuff downstream that leads to there, which you end up kind of ignoring because you're so focused on sort of the simplistic thing. But hey, let us know if this obviously is a complex thing, and like I know it's applicable like outside of like entertainment, and there's maybe different rules apply with like business as they do with like star power and some of that. But I think it is something that Christians should be aware of. But another thing that I definitely think Christians should be aware of, and especially you should be aware of, is our next segment of our show. We have Host Corner. So this is my week to pontificate on some wisdom, share some thoughts. I didn't get a whole lot of sleep last night, so I thought I would just do a grumpy rant, or at least share something, not necessarily a specific pop culture thing that I love, but just something that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and I think kind of touches on maybe just sort of a false perspective on art. So an article this was released the other day about the HBO show Westworld, which I have not seen, so I don't know if the complaints are valid, but where the producer says responds to fan frustrations over the show's unclear meaning. And again, I haven't seen the show, but at least to me, again, I've studied the arts quite a bit. I think it sort of represents this like false expectations that like art and shows and like has to have a meaning. Like we kind of boil everything down. Like what's the message? What's the meaning? I think Christians are particularly bad at doing that. We just sort of want to simplify it to what is this teaching us? And I think as a result, we kind of miss a lot of the potential of art. You can throw up, obviously the classic example maybe of that is like an abstract thing. This is Jackson Pollock, kind of the great abstract artist. What's the meaning of abstract art? I find most Christians just hate abstract art because there's no, it's easier to like digest like Jesus on the cross, or like a biblical scene as it is to just like, an abstract art and colors. But even like beyond that, like books and like, what's the meaning of like a melody, or like an instrumental melody? Obviously lots of art, I think, just doesn't have a meaning. It sort of is its own meaning. It's just say we're playing around with sounds and colors and making things that didn't exist before. And I think kind of when we fall into this trap of like everything has to just have this clear meaning, I think we're kind of over kind of intellectualizing art. But what do you think? Am I just, again, I only got a couple hours of sleep, so I'm grumpy. Is that crazy, or is like,
no, I don't think
there more to it than just like, what does this mean? What does this show like?
Yeah, well, I think I think it's a very human nature thing to always want to ascribe meaning to stuff when sometimes like it just happens. I mean, I think since the dawn of time, like lightning is, the angry Thor. It's like, well, no, it's lightning, and it happens when like cold air and hot air and all these sort of things. And so I think it's very human to like try and like force a meaning onto everything. But I think some of the best like movies and shows and art are the ones that are a bit more ambiguous as to like, well, so what did, what was the intention behind this? Or like, what do you think that, this meant? Then I think those are way more interesting and perhaps more frustrating, but I think in a lot of ways better.
Yeah, just sort of like, maybe a show can just sort of explore things without necessarily having like some clear like agenda of like, we're going to have this character do this to sort of commentate on the human need to like, or it's just, like, what's the meaning of dance? Like, unless you're like in a church and you're like holding up signs and like, we try and like make it into like some kind of allegory thing. Like, I think it's just, hey, we can move gracefully. Some people more than others, so let's celebrate that. But again, maybe I'm just too grumpy, but I do think that it does impact the way Christians make art and like engage in art. And like, I feel like if we go to a museum or something, like the first thought most people are like, what does this mean? Rather than just sort of like receiving it and like accepting it and like the emotions that come with it. But hey, that's just my opinion. I think it's the right opinion, but hey, you're free to disagree and free to be misguided in that sense. Why don't we jump in kind of our main topic for our show? Again, if you're watching us live, I encourage you guys, let us know your thoughts on the conversation as we get into this. And again, I was trying to think sort of what's going on in culture, as Christians. And one of the things, again, I'm wearing my Lord of the Rings shirt. I'm a fantasy buff, and this is sort of a kind of fantasy is having its moment. Like there's fantasy everywhere. I think maybe this week, like the House of Dragon, like the Game of Thrones spinoff comes out. Then like I think 2 weeks, the Rings of Power, Lord of the Rings show, and The Witcher's one of the more popular shows out there. And they just announced like the Aragon, like the old kind of fantasy books from a couple of decades ago, is just coming out as a series, and Percy Jackson, and like there's this. It's like all of a sudden studios and stuff are like, hey, why don't
we do fantasy?
What if we just did fantasy? And like now there's just like tons of competition, and like it's just it's everywhere.
I guess that means that the era of young adult dystopian futuristic movies are over.
Well, they did actually just, I think today, the first teaser of the Hunger Games prequel movie. So maybe there's a little bit of that. And
there's
some overlap in some of that. But kind of just thought we'd just talk about fantasy and kind of imagination, and because it is one of those. It's a weird. It's a weird genre because like most of like the great like fathers and of like fantasy were Christian, but it's become kind of like we appreciate those guys, but nothing since then, and like you better not be making fantasy.
It's all a pale imitation of what Tolkien was doing.
Yeah, we love when Lewis did it. It was great with Narnia, but like Christians just need to be cautious about fantasy and make believe, and it's sort of dangerous unless it was done by this person.
So what do you think that is? Why do you think there are a lot of Christians today that sort of are skeptical or leery of fantasy?
Yeah, I don't know, because I was trying to think. I've written fantasy books, so I kind of was thrown right into that conversation as far as like just some of the uneasiness and like the expectations that like fantasy is okay as long as it's like doesn't have magic
and it's clearly allegorical.
And it's clearly an allegory for like the gospel or something, But outside of that, kind of the Lewis Narnia template, then it's like kind of off bounds. And like I don't know, I think maybe like the two like stumbling blocks or like the reasons for concern is like one is that a lot of fantasy, part of what makes it fantasy, not necessarily, but like is magic. Like that's sort of what sets a lot of fantasy apart is some form of kind of magic or supernatural. And as Christians, that's maybe one of the most hottest buttons that we can push as doing reviews here at the Collision and stuff. Like that's always the number one like concern, or like that always gets the most traction or pushback when anything has that. So I think there's that side of it, and then I think also just the idea that like for whatever reason like living in sort of this like make believe, like that like Christians need to, this expectation that like we need to like be real, like the real world, like we can't go in this like this make believe stuff that's not true, like like a lot of, I think maybe more than like even in the secular world, like a lot of Christians like disparage like just fiction, like the idea that like it's almost like there's pride and like I read theology books, I don't waste my time on like fiction, novels and stuff, like even though they're the authors of those books.
Wish I had time to read a novel. Like, wouldn't that be nice? Yeah,
I was saying this is that recreation time. I choose to use my mind, and like I hear that all the time because I'm a literature buff nerd in that way. So I don't know. Maybe like those two. Like, does that?
No, I think that makes sense to me. Like, I think a lot of times, fantasy is seen as sort of a waste of time, or something that is sort of a distraction from living your life and preaching the gospel and sort of that whole side of things. And I think maybe what gets missed in there is just the benefit of fantasy to one, just to have an imagination. I think especially like as I'm raising two girls, like and one is 3.5, and it's like her imagination is just like off the charts, and it's like who knows like how she thought of these things, but it's like I'm just gonna play along. And I think how horrible it would be if I like tried to like stifle that and be like, well, that's not what a horse would do, or that's not what, try and like correct her, be like, well, that's not real. Like that just seems like for some reason like just very like I would be a horrible parent to like constantly be like trying to like bring her back to reality when she's like playing and using her imagination. And so I think there's just great value in allowing your imagination to go places. And I think you can learn stuff about yourself and about humanity in a lot of these fantasy genre of whether it's books or movies or TV shows, that I think it's trickier to learn just like on a real sort of way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it kind of like I've heard it. People said like it sort of tells the truth at a slant. Like it gives you like a different perspective into human issues. Like it's still very, you just sort of have like the aesthetic or like the framework of magic or fantasy or make believe or creatures and stuff. But like the actual like characters, and, like the journeys and like the morality and like the consequences and like some of those decisions like are still very human, like real life stuff. It's just sort of in the guise of sort of this like make believe stuff. And like one of the things too is like if you go to scripture, if you're trying to think like, is it biblical for like Christians to like engage in like fantasy, is you find like there really isn't, there's nothing in there to back up that like biblically Christians should like stay away from fantasy. Like most of the time I hear it, it's usually just like, I just don't think Christians should like, it's sort of this like personal decision, which is fine. Kind of the only verses that I could kind of find that maybe like you could apply to like, Christians should stay away from fantasy is 1 Timothy 4:7, where Paul says, "But reject profane and old wives' fables and exercise yourself towards godliness." It's kind of speaking against these fables, these, I think other translations, like these old myths and stuff.
Yeah.
And kind of, as that's like contrary to godliness, which if you read that whole passage, like he's talking like in religious context of like, don't sort of believe the superstitions, like don't base your life on that. Like, I don't think he's talking about like, stories. And again, later or in Acts, he is like quoting some of these fables and like these Greek poems, and like so he's definitely aware of what was going on. And then even I didn't pull the specific verses, but kind of the other thing that gets pulled out a bunch is just witchcraft. Like the Bible is very clear, especially the Old Testament, like violently clear, like condemns witchcraft. And I think the discussion becomes like, is Paul saying like, hey, don't join this cult that's sacrificing children down in that forest down there? Is that the same thing as like, don't watch a show that like
employs witchcraft as a tool for storytelling?
And even because even like the witchcraft, like something like Frozen 2, like it's magic, but like is that witchcraft? Like is the ice power like coming from some like satanic? It's in the make believe world, like there's magic, but like it's not tied to like any real world, like
right. And I think that's the thing about that I've never really understood with fantasy is when people get really uptight about it. It's like, well, like are you afraid that like you're gonna like develop ice powers or something? Like if you watch Frozen, like it's so disconnected from reality that it's like it seems kind of funny to me that it would upset people so much that it's like, oh well, we can't watch that because it has witchcraft. It's like, well, then you're not making a distinction between like actual like Wiccan or witchcraft versus like a movie that uses some sort of fantastical powers to be a storytelling tool, and that just kind of seems pretty like a bit like a blunt instrument, I guess, when you're trying to make your entertainment decisions.
Yeah, because like witchcraft, like in the real world, is like in the scriptures, like always tied to sort of this like satanic powers, a very like kind of cultish religious thing, where like there is fantasies that also are like that do tie it that way, like, but like most fantasies and stuff, like it's because it's a whole new, a new world or whatever. Like it's not tied to anything like real, real world. And I just think like I think there are definitely fantasy stories for like Christians to avoid, but like there's also real true story movies that Christians should avoid. Like, I think every genre has stuff to like wade through, and like this is okay, this is not okay. Like, I don't think fantasy is unique in that way, but I do think there just is value, as I think that's why a lot of these the great like kind of fathers of fantasy were Christians. Like, there is value in just sort of the make believe and like this wonder, and like I think kids, even for like children, like obviously these fantasy stories aren't like given a biblical worldview, but like just opening their like imaginations to the fact that like there is more beyond reality or like what they see, and like that it is sort of this healthy kind of educate, or just dealing with like morality or choices, and like some of those things that I think is healthy for a kid. I think as a fantasy nerd myself, like I think it's good for adults too, but like but like any other like,
I think we both agree on that it is like there's just so much that you can learn from and benefit from fantasy. And again, like with all this, don't take it too far. Like if all you ever do is consume fantasy novels and movies, and like just with anything else that you do, like you can obviously overdo it. But I think a good dose of fantasy can be really beneficial.
Yeah, like obviously, and maybe that's the last thing that we can kind of wind it down. But like there is balance. Like like I think like we were talking about before we went live, like some of these like RPG, like role playing, like video games, or like or some of those things where like, you can just get so immersed that you're like in the real world, but like you're really just sort of like, it's like the Inception thing, like who's to say what's real and what's not. Like,
right.
Like that's sort of the world you want to live in, and like I think anything, whether it's fantasy or sports or work or any of these things that like draw you away from your like other priorities and stuff, like is an issue, and fantasy is no different in that way. But I do think it's sort of having this dose of fantasy. I think especially now, like with there's so much divisiveness and like issues and stuff in the world that I think maybe that's why like, fantasy is like making this big return of like just sort of escape for a little bit and just sort of deal with these issues, and then hopefully kind of bring those truths back with us. But hey, let us know any of the fantasy shows that you guys are excited for. If you're a fantasy person, or if you're someone that this is concerned about that and thinks Christians should have nothing to do with it, or let us know why maybe that is. But I do think as fantasy becomes sort of the genre in the next couple of years, like it seems, it's definitely, I think Christians are going to need to think through how we navigate it, how we embrace it, how we kind of work through some of those issues. So now is probably a good time to be doing that before all these shows hit, so that we're prepared. But kind of our last segment of our show, final thoughts. A couple of things kind of going on here at the Collision, things to make you aware of. Could you check out, I mentioned earlier, 13 Lives. This is a movie on Amazon Prime Video, kind of based on the real life, I think 2017, 2018, somewhere in there, the kind of cave rescue, sort of a miraculous story. Really good movie.
We watched it.
I sold you on this one.
Oh, yeah. We watched it over the weekend. And it is, I mean, even though you sort of know the outcome, it is just a really, really good movie. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, and
it is definitely not fantasy, but it's really good.
Yeah, definitely not. Monty in the chat says Star Wars is fantasy, waiting for Ender, and that is sort of the classic. Like people always think that's sci-fi because it's space. Very much a fantasy, kind of traditional, knights against the Dark Lord and magic, force powers, and saving the princess. Like
it's just a space fantasy.
It's a space fantasy. It's kind of a space opera. So even Star Wars kind of contributes to that fantasy. And I think Andor comes out next week, 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, it's September, I think.
Yeah, so soon. Looking forward to that.
Very soon.
One other thing to kind of let you guys know, coming up, Don and Steve in the mornings. This is a morning radio show on Moody Radio. Apparently they had a lax in their judgment, and they invited me to come on their show. They've actually, over the last year, they've ended up discussing some of our Collision material and articles on their show, and they wanted me to come on and kind of talk about a recent article we did on fandom and kind of the religious nature. So I'll be on there. I think it's Thursday. If you're up early, I think it'll be early, or maybe we'll post a link. So excited for that. But anything else going on this week for?
Yeah, I would just the 13 Lives again. Plug that movie, and Light and Magic if you're into sort of how it's made. It's just if you're into Star Wars and how stuff gets made, that is a must watch on Disney Plus for sure.
Yeah, this is the dog days of the movie season, so go check out some of those things that are out there. But hey, guys, I want to thank you guys for joining us again. Encourage you to join us next week here every Tuesday. Always stuff going on, lots of conversations and issues just to work through, and we'd love to have those conversations with you. If you haven't done so, subscribe to our channel, like the video, do all that kind of stuff. Just join with what we're doing here. But thanks for joining us, guys. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.